Hi, everybody. Good morning. I'm going to jump in a second. I'll just give a quick context about what I'm going to do and about myself. So my name's Yotam. I'm Director of Cloud Response at Wiz. I've been doing incident response for about 8 years now. So I've seen a lot of different attacks in a lot of different capacities with a lot of different organizations. A quick disclaimer in addition to the standard disclaimer that we have here is that what I'm going to do today for most of this talk is share the story of a real attack and the real incident response process that followed it. The attack is real. Everything I'm going to show you is stuff that we've seen in the wild. However, I have modified some minor details to avoid identifying the victim of the attack. So I'm happy to answer any questions towards the end, except for those relating to identifying the victim. So that's just the one disclaimer that I have to give. And with that, I'll jump into what we're going to do. So I'll start by telling you how the investigation began and walk you through the process of uncovering the attack itself. It is a fully cloud-native attack, which we're seeing more and more in the wild, and it was a pretty well-done cloud-native attack, to say the least. I'll then rewind the process of the attack that we've uncovered to discuss how every step of it could have been prevented and detected and give you a lot of practical takeaways that hopefully you can use in your own environments based on what we see here. And then finally, I'll give you some high-level takeaways that I think are really valuable for any environment that's dealing with these challenges today. So let's jump in. Is this working? There we go. OK. So when the investigation began, when we were, in essence, called in to start helping with this incident response effort, this was the initial state. So I'm sure some of you have seen similar messages in the past. The organization had a really bad morning. They received this note over email. Actually, a few different executives received similar notes. And essentially, the blacked out pieces are just things that could identify the victim. But what we have here is a ransom demand from an attacker with a few pretty standard parts to it, right? So they're saying you've been attacked. Then they're saying we have your data and we've encrypted your files. And I'll touch on what actually happened in a second. And then they're saying they want a certain amount of money. I know Bitcoin changes a lot. Let's assume at that time it was around $20 million, the request. Probably changed 10 times while I was saying that sentence. And they're essentially requesting that money transferred in Bitcoin to a specific wallet, providing some proof of data that they had exfiltrated. So this was sent along with evidence that some of the victim's data was actually taken. And they're saying they can also provide proof of decryption. So files that were impacted by encryption in this attack, the victim can upload them to a specific link. It's on their dark website and see that decryption actually works. The contact information leads to that dark website, which also has the proof of files that were taken. So initially, this is a pretty bad state to be in, right? It means, and the organization was not aware that anything malicious was going on before receiving this note and the disruption that came right before it. So this is a bad position to be in, but then once the organization started looking through what was going on, they actually got some better news, right? So there were two elements here which made the organization feel better about this situation. The first is all of the important data that the organization had, which it relied on for its production applications, was fully backed up in immutable backups in Azure. So most of the production environment for this organization was in AWS, mostly relying on EC2 instances that are running different applications. But all of the key data that was needed, including code, including actual builds, everything that was really needed to run these production applications was backed up in this immutable backup in Azure. So the organization was feeling pretty safe despite the fact that encryption had taken place, and this encryption by attackers really targeted these EC2 instances. So we'll get into how that happened in a second, but attackers successfully encrypted a lot of files and really downgraded production and stopped some production completely in the AWS environment. The assumption for the organization was we can easily recover because we have this immutable backup in Azure. We don't need the decryption key to get backup and running. That's number one. Number two, another piece of good news here, was that when the organization reviewed the actual files that were provided by the attacker, so the sample data proving what was taken, it didn't look like anything interesting. So this organization did have quite a lot of data that this is a pretty large tech company. They had a lot of applications, a lot of customers in a lot of different countries. So they had a lot of potentially sensitive data and PII of their customers, but the samples all looked like internal, stuff they'd rather not get out, but nothing too dramatic. So these two facts together, having the backups and feeling like the data that was taken isn't that important, wouldn't be the end of the world if it leaked, gave the organization a lot more confidence, and it led to a decision not to pay the ransom. So different response efforts were going on behind the scenes, of course, trying to figure out how this happened, strengthening the environment to prevent further damage, but the decision not to pay was based on these two major factors. Now, unfortunately, as those of you who've been in incident response situations probably know, there's a difference between the better news in theory and the unfortunate reality. So these better news quickly turned into some worse news for the organization. So first, on this Azure backup side, I mentioned that the organization had this stuff in Azure, that pretty much everything they needed to get back up and running. Now, unfortunately, this stuff in Azure was managed, in this case, with client-side encryption keys. So it was encrypted by keys that were only available to the victim organization here, not to Microsoft or Azure themselves. And those keys were stored in different places, but it turns out that one key, which was responsible for a large percentage of the data in the backup, was only stored in one place. It was stored in HashiCorp Vault, and that Vault instance was running on an EC2 instance in the AWS environment. Now, unfortunately, I'm hearing some people went ahead of me here to figure out what happened. Unfortunately, that was the only place the key was, so the files HashiCorp Vault was relying on got encrypted themselves. So when the organization went in to the vault to try and get the key so that they could use their backups, they're getting an error saying they can't actually access the files themselves. So the backup is fine, right? The backup is still immutable and it's doing very well. It's perfect, right? The attackers aren't able to do anything about it, but the organization can't either, right? The key itself is encrypted, so the entire recovery plan here goes out the window. Now, you don't want to be in the room with the CEO when he gets this news, that the whole recovery plan that they had planned for, they had incident response plans, all based on this idea that critical data is in this immutable backup, and therefore they will not need to pay a ransom. That all goes out the window here, and that's really a dramatic understanding. Now, in this specific case, if you recall, part of what attackers graciously offered to do in their ransom note was to provide proof of life by decrypting 2 or 3 example files for the organization to prove that it's doable. So we said, hey, wait a minute. We only really care about one file here. It's that data file for HashiCorp Vault, which includes the key. So what if we just upload that to the proof of life, regardless of paying any ransom, to get attackers to do this? Now, to be honest, this kind of decision, we had this idea, but this kind of decision had to be brought up all the way to executive management and the CEO because there's obviously a risk here, right? If it works, great. If it doesn't, then we're running the risk that attackers are realizing what we're doing. Now they're going to raise the price dramatically because they may not know we don't have the key to this backup in some other place, but now they would, right, if we're trying to do this. So there is a risk-benefit analysis to do here. But again, based on experience, these large ransom groups, the way they operate is really like a business. You can read some interviews with these people. They have HR departments. They're really big and they operate as a business. And therefore, it's very unlikely from our perspective that the person responsible for doing the chat support and actually interacting with this proof of life is a technical person that's also responsible for running the attack and would know what's even being sent. It's very likely that it's somebody who's pretty junior who's just getting files, running them through a decryption script, sending them back. Not much more than that. So we got approval to try this out, and it worked. So the attackers sent us the decrypted file, the one file that we actually cared about in this case. Thank you. Yeah, that's a great win in this case. So we were able to get rid of that part of the problem, and recovery was able to proceed as planned. So that's terrific. It does underline some of the challenges that face organizations in these kinds of situations, but we did get away with that. Now, based on this and the initial understanding that the taken data, at least the samples the attackers sent, wasn't too sensitive, the organization made the decision, again, as I mentioned, not to pay the ransomware. However, once that deadline was expired and the attackers realized they're not going to get paid, they published the files that they had, and it turned out that they had a lot more than the sample that they gave, and that other bunch of data did include some sensitive customer PII. So whether or not this would have changed the original decision to pay, hard to say in retrospect, right? Like once this happened, management was already saying, well, we wouldn't have paid anyway because we don't want to pay these guys. We don't want to encourage the ransom, but it's hard to know, right? It's hard to put yourself in the position of a business that's now being extorted for very sensitive data. So like as you're saying, it's hard to say, but here the decision's already been made, right? So it's too late. This data was leaked, and it did include a lot more data than they thought, including a lot more sensitive data and customer PII. So this is the initial state, right? Regardless of everything that happened technically, this is where we are when the investigation began. And I do just want to mention one thing, regardless of the fact that here the decision that was made was not to pay the ransom, we did do what we always recommend to do in these cases of ransom engagements, especially with large, well-known groups as this one was, and that's to engage with the attackers, regardless of the decision to pay. So when I say engage, I'm not saying that executives should engage themselves. We've seen some that want to do that. Not a good idea. Even if they're excellent negotiators, just why have their name tied to this and then the attacker can leak it? Not a good idea. But if, as part of the incident response process, an expert negotiator can reach out, regardless of the ability to lower the price, there are two other benefits, right? The first benefit is just we can buy time. Deadlines get pushed, and that's great because that's more time for the investigative team to do what they need to do. And number two is we get valuable information, right? So by engaging, we can ask attackers, hey, prove that you've done this. We want to know that so that we can convince the board to pay or something like that. And that helps us also on the investigative side. What we often even do is if we can catch out attackers in a lie in information they give because of our investigative progress, we feed that back into the negotiation. That helps us buy even more time because then we can say something like, hey, look, you said this, but our investigators say something else. Our board doesn't trust you. We don't know if we can pay. That kind of thing helps reduce the price, buy time, get more and more information. So engagement is useful even if the decision, as it was in this case, is not to pay. So that was a little bit of the context and the background of where we were, but now I want to jump into the actual investigation and how we uncovered the attack. So starting from the very end, right, we knew what happened. We knew that a lot of data on EC2 instances was encrypted, including that HashiCorp Vault server. So we wanted to see what happened. So we went to look at those EC2s. We're looking at any logging that we have. We're looking at some logging that we didn't have initially, but we could get from the cloud provider, in this case AWS. That sometimes works if you're able to request specifically enough. And here we saw that there was just nothing indicating any network communication or connections to these targeted EC2 instances before encryption took place. There was nothing indicating network communications coming in from internet IP addresses and nothing out of the ordinary within the network itself. So that indicated to us that it didn't come from some external network source, but rather from within the cloud environment itself. So once we went around and looked for events within the cloud logging, in this case CloudTrail in AWS, we went looking for events that are connected to all of these many instances that were encrypted, that were targeted by encryption. What we saw is these specific events. So basically, we saw that attackers were leveraging AWS SSM, right? So a tool that enables you to run commands through the cloud environment on machines running in the cloud, using that to send a broad command to pretty much every EC2 instance they could in the environment, in this case, targeted at encrypting files. So the reason this is interesting, SSM is common, its use is common in a lot of environments and in a lot of attacks, but here what attackers are doing is leveraging the fact that they have access to the cloud control plane to really target the entire environment all at once. This would be much harder to do in an on-prem environment, even if you have full domain admin or access to something like a management tool or an EDR. Because of the way these environments are built, it's much harder to have a single tool like this, which easily, in an automated way, just runs the same code on all the machines at once. You don't have to worry about availability, getting to them, maybe some machine is off or disconnected like in an on-prem environment. Here, they were able to run this SSM send command as their tool for encryption. And that's a very powerful use of the cloud environment for disruption of the target environment. In this case, we can also see that in addition, the actual instance IDs and stuff that could identify the environment is blacked out, but some of the stuff here that's blacked out that is interesting is that stuff on which I put in EC2 role. So we can see that the user or the identity that was used in this case to create this event, to create this mass encryption, was a specific role that's associated with a single EC2 instance in the environment, right? So in AWS, we can assign roles to EC2 instances so that they can do different operations that they need to. And that's what we see here as the source. So we now know that from the very last point that we had, right, disruption on EC2, we know this came through SSM. Now, another endpoint that we already knew about was the data that was exfiltrated, and cross-referencing that data with where the company was storing its data, we quickly realized it had to come from S3 buckets. That's really the only place where that data could have come from. And looking at logging for those S3 buckets for the places where the specific stolen data could have come from, we quickly see that attackers performed very similar activities. So the same EC2 instance role that I mentioned before was used to exfiltrate data from these S3 buckets. So essentially, the same role that enabled the attacker to perform the encryption and do the damage to these EC2 instances also enabled the attacker to exfiltrate the data. And we can see across the board, they really performed several actions, one after the other in S3. So again, a lot of it's blacked out to avoid identifying the victim, but this specific EC2 role is coming in from the attacker's IP address, not from an IP address associated with this organization. And it's running a lot of recon, essentially, initially, right? A lot of list and describe events. And then it's also exfiltrating the actual files. When we looked back to see when this activity began, trying to trace back our timeline when the attacker could have started using this role, what we see here on the left side, on your right side, is that we have an initial call. This is a get caller identity request, right? So very commonly, the first request that attackers which compromise an identity in AWS are going to run to make sure just that it works, right? They run this command, they get a confirmation that they're actually running through this new role that they now have. So we know attackers pretty quickly before doing the actual exfiltration and disruption gained access to this new role. This whole thing happened within less than an hour of initial access to the role, so we know attackers really moved swiftly. Now, this understanding obviously makes us want to understand where the role came from, how attackers got this very privileged access. And because it's a role associated with a specific EC2 instance, the obvious place to go looking is that EC2 instance itself. So when we go another step back and we try to figure out how the attackers performed the privilege escalation here in AWS, we look at the instance itself. We try to analyze it in any way we can. Luckily here we were able to grab an image, an AMI, of this EC2 instance, so everything that was on it was preserved for us to investigate. And running some forensics on that instance itself, what we can quickly see is just to identify the command that we were looking for, right? So this may be familiar to a lot of you. This is a very common thing, unfortunately, that attackers take advantage of if IMDS v1 is enabled, as it was here. So attackers could use the metadata service to run a command on the machine itself, on this EC2 instance, to receive the token, essentially to run commands now as the role associated with this EC2 instance. So this is a legitimate tool within AWS, right? If you have an application running on the EC2 instance which needs to use this credential, you want it to be able to access this. However, this use by attackers is obviously damaging because it means they could move from OS access to this machine. They could escalate privileges, go from there to the cloud control plane level, right? They're essentially both escalating privileges because this is more privileged, but also moving laterally from just machine access to full cloud control plane access. So this is OS to cloud lateral movement, which is very powerful for the attacker because instead of accessing one machine, they now have this privilege role, which as we saw was used to exfiltrate a lot of data and encrypt a lot of machines. So very valuable move on the side of the attacker. Now, once we saw this, we now have our little timeline of the attack starting to build on the bottom, right? So we had this encryption of EC2s, we had exfiltration from S3, we know it came from SSM, we know that came from targeting the IMDS on this specific machine. We want to know how attackers got to this machine, right? That's the obvious next step. And again, looking at logging and access to the machine, we see the same thing that we saw on the machines that were targeted with encryption. There are no out-of-the-ordinary network connections from any internet IP addresses. There's nothing on the machine itself which indicates something like persistent malware or a shell that's facing the internet, anything like that on the machine. But we already know these attackers, right? We've been investigating, so we know what to look for, right? If they did it once, why not again? And very quickly, what we identify is the way that they performed access to this initial machine. The machine wasn't just used to do OS to cloud lateral movement, but the attackers also performed cloud to OS lateral movement. So once again, we see the attackers using SSM, the same service that they used to encrypt broadly, to send commands to all of these machines. They use the same service to send a command to just this one machine. So in our logging, we can see these are logs for the SSM agent itself on the machine. We can see they use this run command to run a bash script, which enabled them to run more command through this bash script with a temporary shell. And this is very useful for us to understand because we can now trace it back slightly further. So first of all, we now know the attackers again used SSM as a way of targeting a machine. So what we understand so far is they had cloud access, they moved to OS access, they moved from that OS access to even more privileged cloud access and used that to exfiltrate and encrypt data. But more than that, what we can see when we look at these events, right, we have this SSM command. We found it on the machine itself, but now we can go back to AWS logging and see who ran this SSM command, right? Because attackers are obviously doing this cloud to OS bouncing around to increase their privileges. They're not just moving laterally for the fun of it. As we saw, they're going very quickly, so they wouldn't waste time on this. So what we see is that the user or the identity that initially ran this command in the cloud, that used SSM to get access to this machine, was a specific, and again, it's blacked out, but I just put on it so that you can see what it is. It is a federated role in AWS. A federated role, meaning this is an identity that was not authenticated within AWS itself. This is an identity that was authenticated with an identity provider and granted SAML authentication access to AWS. So in this case, the identity provider used by the company was Azure Entra. So, or Azure AD if you want to call it. And this is what they were using here to provide access, legitimate access for a lot of their employees. So that means here, we now know that attackers were successfully moving from access to a separate cloud environment, a different cloud environment, right, this identity provider environment, into the AWS environment, leverage that access to move laterally from the cloud to OS, from OS back to the cloud, and then to encrypt and exfiltrate data. So naturally, as the investigative process progresses, we have to go back in our timeline, right? So we know that we have this use of SSM, and we want to know where it came from. So we want to look at this cross-cloud lateral movement. How did attackers get from this one place that they had, right, this some access to the Azure Entra identity provider to AWS? And we very quickly identified these original events. So looking at and comparing actually the logs from both sides, right? We have logs on the identity provider side from Azure, and we have other logs on the AWS side. AWS IAM showing us within CloudTrail who logged in and when. And we can see here that attackers came in using SAML SSO, coming in from this other environment, from this Azure environment. And that's useful for us because we now have a time frame. We now know exactly when the attackers first came in. That helps us, close down and secure the AWS environment because we don't have to worry now that attackers have been in there for 3 months because we can see that all of this really happened within a couple days. So a very quick attack. And B, we can now tie it back to events on the other side. So the user that came in from Azure, and now our investigation focus has to move from AWS to Azure itself. Moving back there, we need to figure out how attackers got that privilege in Azure, right? How is it that they were able to perform this access? And what we see is a couple of interesting things. First of all, the user that performed this action in Azure itself, it has a pretty generic name, dev user. And this dev user, just talking to the people who work there and who manage this Azure environment, was not something that they were familiar with. This is not a user that belonged to the company, apparently. Like, it was in their environment, but they had never seen it before. So it was a bit strange. Looking at the logs, we quickly identified that this user was actually just created a few hours before it was first used to jump over to the AWS side. And once that was understood, we can try and take a look and see where it was created from, right? Because again, we're just following the breadcrumbs, going back and back through the investigation to figure out what the attacker did at every single step. So here we can see that the display name, again, part of it's blacked out, but it's a specific server, a specific machine, a VM within the Azure environment that led to the creation of the user, that executed the command, which eventually put this user in a position to create this connection to AWS. So looking at the machine itself, again, we're jumping back. So before we had cloud to OS lateral movement, now we have OS to cloud lateral movement, right? Attackers apparently came in through a VM in Azure, used that to move laterally by creating a user. How did they do that? Well, this machine had privileges in the environment. They were never used before to create users, but it could. It could create users because it was slightly misconfigured. And then looking at the machine itself, again, we just go into the bash history now on the machine because we want to see what happened. And we find there's a lot of commands on there. The attackers did a lot of recon and a bunch of other things, but this little snippet can show you the important parts of it. So the first thing I want to focus on is this, right? So we can see the attacker is using the Azure CLI to run Azure API commands from this VM in Azure, right? So this initial access to an Azure machine enables the attacker to run a bunch of recon and additionally to run this specific command, creating a brand new user, this dev user that was created by the attacker and then used throughout the attack to establish the further access. And then they're adding this user to a specific group that has a role in Azure, which enables this AWS single account access. So that's the SSO, the SAML authentication that's enabled to AWS. And finally, they're using the API for assigning new roles to users within Azure. So this machine, this one VM, even though it was never used in such a way, had the privileges to do this. It could create a new user and it could add it to this very powerful group. And that means access to this one machine in Azure, right? Not even in AWS, was sufficient for the attackers to gain full control of the AWS environment, right? Because of this process and repeated process of going OS to cloud, cloud to OS, cross-cloud lateral movement, and doing it again. So this single piece of access, which we don't even know where it came from yet, but this single piece of access was sufficient to enable the entire rest of the attack to happen very quickly. Again, the whole thing happened in less than 2 days. So really highlighting the importance of least privileges management on even these VMs, not just on specific users assigned to specific people. Now, taking another step back, obviously we want to know how attackers even got to this machine. And we started looking, as before, at any network connections. We were also looking to see if maybe the attacker again somehow came in from the cloud control plane environment, right? But here we couldn't see anything like that. Instead, as we were looking in more and more logs on this machine, we couldn't see anything that looked like, you know, an administrative port access like SSH. But what we did see is this machine was actually running an internet-facing application. It had an Apache server running on it. And looking through the Apache logs, we quickly identified the fact that the initial compromise of this machine came by exploiting, known at this point, CVE in this specific version of Apache. So again, a lot of it's blacked out. But I want to mention a couple of interesting things here. First of all, this CVE was out there, right? It's not like a 0-day that was used by the attacker. It was out there. However, the organization, despite having some vulnerability management capabilities, just didn't get around to fixing every single machine that had this running on it. As I mentioned before, the most important production applications were actually running in AWS, not in Azure. So Azure was less prioritized as far as when things were going to get patched. And they did have a patching system, and this CVE was known in there was some alert and some vulnerability management system within the organization, but they didn't get around to it quickly enough from the time it was released until attackers were already exploiting it to target the organization. And the fact that the same CVE was already covered, was already patched in many other places in the organization didn't matter, right? This one Achilles heel was enough to let attackers in to do the damage that they needed to do. So that's number one. Another interesting element of this, which I want to mention, is we see here now how attackers got their initial access, right? They use this vulnerability to run code remotely on this VM in Azure. However, if you notice the IP addresses on the left, I only blacked out half of them. And the reason for that is because the first half is indicative. It's indicative of the fact that these IP addresses are Azure IP addresses. So the attackers, which were exploiting this machine and coming in to their initial access to the organization, weren't coming in from some generic VPN or from whatever their own IP addresses in some foreign country or something like that, not at all. They were coming in from Azure IP addresses, and that's interesting because obviously if attackers are coming in through Azure, they're doing it for a reason, right? They know Azure is managed, potentially Microsoft could go and investigate things that are going on, but they're doing this to evade detection. Right? So a lot of the more sophisticated attacks that we're seeing in the cloud now are not just using generic VPNs or their own IP addresses to initiate the attacks, but rather they're coming in through other cloud environments to make sure that the activity, because there's plenty of Azure IP addresses communicating with Azure all the time, right? So when you run an Azure environment, you see other Azure IP addresses all the time. You don't necessarily go in and investigate what each one of them signifies. And that means attackers could stay below the radar this way. So the last step that I want to explain here of the attack before even using this app vulnerability to get in is the way that attackers obfuscated their initial access to establish this foothold. So we're seeing this with a lot of different attacks. Again, there's no way for me to verify how many steps are taken before I start my investigation, but the process that we're seeing becoming more and more common is attackers do this. From the attacker's machine, from wherever they're running the attack, when they try to perform this initial access, they go through a couple of steps. First, they do go through anonymizing VPNs because it's extra security for them and why not. But then instead of going from the VPN to the target environment, what they do is go from the VPN to another cloud environment. In this case, it's not usually going to be something that they paid for, something associated with them, but rather another compromised environment. So in this case, the most likely assumption is the attackers had compromised another Azure environment that belongs to somebody else. Maybe it wasn't interesting enough to monetize, so they didn't try to ransom it, but they did have access to it, and they used it as a tunnel to establish access to the victim Azure environment. And that means that from a detection perspective, this is much harder, right? Your malicious communication is coming in from Azure IP addresses, which you're seeing all the time, rather than some easily identifiable VPN or a place in the world that you've never had communication with. So the initial access actually begins before our attack even begins, right? It begins with another compromised Azure environment that we don't even know when it was compromised or how, and that's really less of our interest for this specific story. So this is a pretty comprehensive story of the way that we understood the attack. And based on this, what I want to do now is what I mentioned before. I want to rewind. So we just went back through everything, right? Through the linear investigation process, which led us to understanding the attack. Now, I want to rewind all of this and focus, instead of how we performed this investigation, to focus on the remediation and mostly detection mechanisms, which should have been in place to prevent or at least detect and stop most of the malicious activity here. So let's just take an overview of the attack that we had here. A couple of things to note. I'm not going to re-explain the whole thing. But first of all, this is a highly, highly cloud-native attack. Every single step in this chain of events was completely unique to the fact that the attack was happening in the cloud. Pretty much none of this could have been done in the same way in an on-prem environment. Now, cloud environments aren't inherently more or less secure, and we'll touch more on that a little bit later, but they are different, right? And this means that detection and prevention mechanisms need to be prepared for this kind of very cloud native, very fast. The whole thing happened in less than 2 days, and very efficient attack. Now, more than that, another key point that I want to make about this attack is this. Right? So we spoke before about the way that the attacker was moving around between cloud and OS repeatedly. But look at what's going on here. So this scattering of random events in the attack is actually the linear attack that we saw before. Right? So what the attacker was doing is they got their initial access to some compromised Azure environment fully cloud level. Right? Then they used a known CVE, a vulnerability, to exploit an OS level. This is a machine, right? This machine could have been running on-prem as well, but what they were doing is going from cloud to machine, then going from there to compromising this Azure VM itself, which is running in the cloud, but it's an OS level event, right? It's not a cloud level event, from which they created a brand new Azure user and added it to the right group in Azure. Then they performed this cross-cloud lateral movement and used that new access to get the initial foothold in AWS. Then they again moved downwards, right, using SSM, down towards OS level, right, to run a command on a machine in AWS. Then they used IMDS, this specific service within AWS, to go from the OS to expanded privileges in AWS. So again, OS to cloud, cloud to OS, right? Back up to these expanded privileges to exfiltrate from S3, purely a cloud event, and then back down to a cloud OS event, machines that are running in the cloud, right? These OS level machines, these EC2 instances, but the encryption is happening fully at the OS level, right? This is encryption, it's not a purely cloud event. So even though it's all happening within machines that are in the cloud. So the whole attack is leveraging the cloud environment in a very efficient way, right? It's not just limiting itself to this is a cloud attack, so we can only use cloud APIs. It's going back and forth from OS to cloud repeatedly, and also from different AWS and Azure environments, so different cloud environments, to achieve its goals. And that's the important point that I want to make here, is that when users look at this kind of environment, they're not necessarily taking the approach that a DevOps team, right, might. Like, if a DevOps team would look at this environment, it's likely you would have certain people focused on managing AWS and other people focused on managing Azure, and maybe other people focused on managing the identity part of this. You would also have maybe different people focused on what's running on the machines themselves, the OS level, versus people concerned with the cloud environment as a whole in the control plane. But from the attacker's perspective, that doesn't matter at all, right? They're moving very easily, OS to cloud, different cloud environments, to get to the eventual goal that they have in the attack. And that's really an important point of the challenge of responding to this kind of attack. So what I want to do now is quickly walk through a very non-exhaustive but important list of specific things that could have been done to prevent or detect different elements of this attack. So starting from the beginning of the attack now, because now we know the whole thing, I don't have to go from back to front, I can go front to back. So from where the attacker began, there's a couple things even on this initial step that could have been done better, right? So number one, and this is really, really important, is rapid vulnerability identification and remediation. So the attackers came in using a known CVE, right? A known CVE that was out there. The organization actually had already patched the CVE in other systems, just not this one system that the attackers were targeting. Now, from the organization's perspective, sure, they have 1,000 CVEs to take care of, and they have a lot of different machines. They have to prioritize. They have to be as effective as they can about that prioritization. But from the attacker's perspective, it doesn't matter at all, right? They're scanning the internet, looking for anything that would be a match to this vulnerability. And once they find something, they're in, and they do their work very quickly. So that means that within the organization, we need to be able to very quickly remediate these things when they come out, especially in cloud environments, because we know attackers are constantly doing this kind of action in an automated way. So as many of you may know, at Wiz, we recently acquired Daz to be part of the Wiz family, and the whole focus of what Daz is trying to do and what we're now incorporating into Wiz is being able to rapidly identify exactly who owns each of these applications, what's vulnerable right now, how we prioritize it effectively to move quickly enough to do this, because it really is a very large problem that's facing organizations. The second point I want to mention here is irregular activity from cloud IP address. Now, whenever I use the word irregular or unusual or something like that in alerting, what I actually mean is behavioral baseline analysis, right? Because as I mentioned, the attacker came in from an Azure IP address. Azure IP addresses are not rare. They're not unique in this Azure environment. So that in and of itself could not have triggered a generic alert. However, if we have more sophisticated, tailored baseline-based alerts, then we could have identified that even though this IP address is not known to be malicious, it's Azure, the fact that this specific IP address is communicating with our specific machine may be out of the ordinary, because it turns out, in this case, this specific machine that received that communication had never received Apache web communications from another Azure IP, except for the ones that are internal to the company. So that kind of analysis, while not generic, if we're collecting the right amount of logs, we can create that kind of effective detection. And that's a lot of the work that we're doing in Wiz Defend, is focused on this, finding these kinds of behavioral opportunities to catch the more sophisticated, more stealthy attackers. Now, moving a little bit forward in the attack itself, the steps the attacker took on the VM and to create the new users, there's a few things here. So one is something I already mentioned before on the prevention side. We want to prevent overly permissive privileges to such machines, right? The fact that a VM is only running one application and no user in the company is ever going to use it for themselves doesn't mean that it can't be compromised. And therefore, least privileges applies to this as well, not just to individual users and what they get. In addition, on the detection side, this is really important. So I kept referring to the fact that the attack was moving cloud to OS, OS to cloud again and again. That means we need to be able to tie these things together. So we want to have alerting of something like creation of a new user from a VM, which is probably a rare event. But we also want to be able to see that a rare CLI command was executed on the machine itself, right? Because when these machines, especially running specific applications, are running, usually they're running the same stuff all the time. So even if they have CLI access, it's going to be a pretty known subset of commands. So for us, when we build this kind of alerting, it's really important for us to combine the cloud level visibility, right, from logging, whatever it is, AWS, Azure, GCP, with the OS level runtime visibility. Having a sensor on the machine itself is a big part of the way that we approach this kind of detection and response, so that it's collecting runtime process information, and we can correlate it with the cloud level information. Moving a little bit further along in the sequence of events, attackers jumped over, right, this cross-cloud lateral movement. They came from Azure to AWS, leveraging the fact that there was federated identity and trust. Now, this is fine, right? This is a common architecture, but there are things we can do to detect this. First, if you remember here, the attacker created a brand new user and then immediately added it to some very high privileges, including giving it global admin privileges in Azure. That's something that we should be able to detect, right? Because even if that happens legitimately, it doesn't happen often. So I'd rather have one false positive a year for this kind of alert when a real new global admin is created than miss something like this and have the security team chasing their own tails for something this important. Second is we have a very privileged user here doing a federated login for the very first time, right? Because it's a new user. So the fact that it was doing a federated login on the AWS side is also new. Again, this would happen legitimately once in a while. Sometimes we create a new privileged user and it does this for the first time. But the amount of false positives is going to be very small. I'm going to take questions in just a minute. Moving on just a little bit further in the attack here. As I mentioned, the attacker was using the AWS access to run SSM commands on the machine. But again, we had overly permissive role assignments to the federated access, right? So regardless of the fact that the attackers had pretty much all the privileges they wanted on the Azure side, if AWS was more closed down, then even this federated access maybe couldn't have gained this much access, right? Maybe it should have been more limited, especially for a brand new user that they were not aware of. So we had that, and we had the execution of irregular code, new code. I mentioned irregular means we're looking for stuff that's out of the ordinary, out of the baseline, on this target machine, right? So in this case, it was SSM being used to run the IMDS command. Remember, to get this more privileged user within AWS, the one that's associated with the machine. So again, very out of the ordinary and something that we should be able to detect. And a couple more points I want to make here. First, obviously, IMDS v1, and there's a lot of other misconfigurations here that could and should be prevented. This should not be enabled. But moreover, we have the rare usage of these commands on an EC2 instance. And moving forward, if you recall, we had a lot of data that was exfiltrated. And the fact that the data was exfiltrated, in addition to the fact that we could have identified it by looking at the amount of commands, the first line here is very important, right? To have continuous mapping of sensitive data. The organization wasn't even sure what was taken, right? And they thought that very little was taken initially, and they thought based on the attacker sample there wasn't a big deal. That's a mistake that shouldn't happen, right? So if we have continuous, not just one time, continuous tools that are mapping what's going on in the environment, identifying all the sensitive data, telling us, hey, you just put something sensitive there and you may not know about it, we could use that access to prevent or at least detect in time and then prevent the rest of the potential exfiltration from occurring. Finally, the last bits of the attack here, obviously we don't want to get that far, but if we're already getting that far and attackers are performing this kind of encryption and damage within the environment, is we want to prevent the usage of EC2 roles from non-AWS IP addresses, because EC2 roles should only be associated with the EC2 that they're there for. So we don't want to have this happening, and we should definitely detect when this happens, because this is a rare event that really attackers are using, but we don't often see for legitimate reasons. And more than that, we had this unusually broad use of SSM to run commands on every single machine in the environment. We had these wide encryptions of files, and that's something that is, even if not preventable once the attacker has this kind of access, is detectable. And once it's detected, we can move quicker to take snapshots, to prevent this access, to maybe rotate the credentials behind the user. So we could prevent a lot of the damage by early detection. And again, it's crucial here because of the speed at which the attacker is moving. So before I stop for questions, I just want to leave you guys, first of all, this is just a longer list of all of these things that I mentioned here in case I see a lot of phones in the air trying to take pictures. So this is a combined list, although, as I mentioned before, this is not exhaustive. But I do want to leave you guys with 3 key, more high-level takeaways. The first is the cloud-specific attacks really do require cloud-specific defenses. So as I said before, the cloud's not more or less inherently secure, but it's different. Every step of this attack was cloud unique, and therefore the attack surface for attackers is different. What a lot of organizations who are still making the transition to the cloud are doing is they're essentially trying to copy and paste the access and the defensive policies and their procedures from the on-prem environment to the cloud. That doesn't work. It's a different challenge, and we need to approach it as is, because otherwise attackers are just going to win. That's number one. Number two is the importance of rapid risk remediation in the cloud. So this has always been important. It's important on-prem as well. But as you saw here, the entire attack took less than 2 days. And the use of the CVE led to the rest of the attack. All of these little misconfigurations led to every next bit of the attack. And unless we move really quickly to continuously identify any risk that we have in a cloud environment, and then use that knowledge to quickly remediate the top priority things, we lose even if we have all the right data, right? So knowing what all our problems are, but taking 2 months to fix them is probably too late, definitely too late for an attack like this. And that's a lot of the focus of what we're doing at Wiz, right, is being able to prioritize and enable this kind of rapid, continuous remediation of issues. The last point I want to make here is about centralized visibility. So this is a challenge for a lot of organizations in the cloud, right? We have a lot of different applications. We have their own logs. We have, in this case, AWS and Azure, many other environments potentially. We could have stuff like GitHub, OS level logging, cloud level logging, all of that stuff. Unless it's all brought into one place, into a single system, we're not going to be able to create effective detection that's based on these correlations, right? Because they're just in different places. So automatic detection's out of the window. And even during an investigation, it's much harder to investigate when you have to go running around getting data from a whole bunch of different places. Having everything in one place is really a must for effective cloud detection and response, because otherwise, even if we have all the right data, we're just going to be too slow. If the whole attack takes 2 days and we investigate in 3 days, we've already lost. Right? So that's the last point that's important for me to make here. And with that, I thank you, and I'll take some questions. Yeah.
Yeah, hello. I'm very curious about like what was the generic timing between the investigation of that whole long kill chain versus the restoration from your immutable backups, I guess once you got your key back.
Sure. So honestly, a lot of the process in this case was separate, right? We ran these processes in parallel. The investigation itself, finding all of what I explained here, took a few days, probably 4 to 5 days before the investigation to be complete, because obviously it's not just this stuff, it's a lot of other stuff that surrounds the story that I didn't get into here. As far as the recovery, so because it was put in Azure and it was immutable, and they knew what they were doing, it was relatively rapid. Like once they decided to spin back up the specific applications and machines. What did take slightly longer is, at least in the initial phase of the investigation, we wanted to make sure that we can say the cloud environment's now secure before spinning machines back up, right? Because we don't want to spin them back up and then they get encrypted again because we missed some access. So
and they'll do it harder and make you pay more the second time.
Right, exactly.
Right.
So what we did here is run a parallel process, right? So we established a smaller temporary cloud environment, which we knew was clean because it was separate from everything, and they started running only the critical applications there from day one. So once we got the backup up and running, from day one, they already had stuff running. But until everything was where it was before the attack, that took, I think, about a week and a half. Yeah.
Thank you.
Sure.
Happy Yom Ha'atzmaut to those who celebrate. I have 2 really dumb questions. First one is, when we were creating that power user, shouldn't there have been an MFA call there to allow for that to happen?
So in theory, yes. In a better
theory.
configuration, you should. In this case, the creation of the user was done by a VM, which had the role associated with it. Now, in most cases, you don't have MFA enabled for these application users, these service users, because they're only used by an application. So in this case, the VM it shouldn't have had it, but it had this overprivileged, and then there was no MFA required. They could run forward.
Okay. And then second dumb question is, at these RSA keynotes over the years, they've promised us a lot of things. One of the things that they promised us was, wow, now that we're moving to the cloud, we're going to be able to, create a side copy of your entire cloud environment and automate patch management, in real time, and all these vulnerabilities, they'll just get fixed like almost instantaneously, and then you'll do a switch and you'll be all set. It's been a few years, and I don't see that happening. Do you see anything remotely like that unicorn that they promised us?
Well, I guess it depends on what you mean by the unicorn. So I think there are a lot of advantages, right?
Well,
Even here,
I'm thinking about the vulnerability that you said, oh, well, they didn't get around to patching it. Yeah.
Right. But so the existence of vulnerabilities, I don't think the cloud does anything to prevent that from occurring in the future. Like, investigators and researchers are going to keep finding vulnerabilities and finding new ways to attack environments. What the cloud can enable us to do is remediate much faster. And be on top of it, that's what I was mentioning before, like with the idea of continuous mapping, not only of what CVEs do we have, but who owns which application, how do we wake them up right now if we need to, so they go and fix what needs to be fixed. That's number one. Number two, there's a lot of additional protections that we can put in place. Nothing's like automatically solved by the cloud, but the fact that we're able to very quickly have something like this immutable backup to get back up and running, or to very quickly have automated response playbooks, like we've identified something, we now want to have a single click of a button to enable us to quarantine a machine, remove a user, do all that stuff. That is a big advantage. So I think, like I said before, like the cloud has its advantages and disadvantages. As long as we're using them well, we can win. But otherwise, attackers are definitely using them well. So we don't want to be the ones that are left behind.
Thank you.
Sure.
Once the attackers had admin on the control plane, they basically had this org by the short hairs, and yet they just went to encryption and exfiltration. They could have done much, much, much worse than that from here. I mean, they basically had the ability to delete the entire account if they wanted to. And everything in it. Why did they just stop short of that, and why did they leave so many informative logs in place?
That's a really good question. I I have a few-part answer, actually. So first of all, deleting the entire account, they didn't have root access. They had way more access than they should have, but they came in through this federated access, so they couldn't have just deleted the AWS environment. They could have deleted a lot of resources, a lot more than they did. I think there's a two-part answer to the rest of this for why maybe they operated this way. First, ransom attacks are very common in the cloud, but ransomware attacks where they actually perform encryption are not that common. And the reason is that I think attackers are realizing this more and more is that most companies that wind up paying are paying to protect the data and not necessarily to protect the production of the environment. It's not exclusive, but in the cloud, because of stuff like this, like immutable backups, it's much easier for organizations to recover if they have the proper things in place in advance. Like here, we almost didn't, right? But I think attackers know this, so their focus in the cloud is turning more and more towards data and exfiltration and just asking for money for that. And a lot of attacks only do that without disruption versus the actual doing damage. And so they did it here, but only to an extent. The last point I'd make on that is I think speed matters here, right? They're running a lot of attacks in parallel. They have a playbook, they just follow it. So here, encryption, data exfiltration, we're done. I'm sure if they would have spent more time, more than 2 days for the whole attack, they could have come up with more painful ways to cause disruption here, like deleting some resources, like, I don't know, maybe finding more things to encrypt instead of just stuff on EC2. Maybe they could have encrypted some stuff in S3, some stuff that was stored in RDS. They didn't do that here. I think speed is probably the main consideration here because they're doing a cost balancing analysis, figuring they can get paid anyway. Why? You got to get into their head for that. That's, I guess, beyond my expertise.
Okay, thanks.
Hey, I do have another question.
I think we're out of time for questions. I'm sorry, but I'm happy to stay and take questions. Thank you again, everybody.